Hey there, I'm Jordan, and welcome back to my channel. This channel is all about filmmaking techniques, the philosophy of art, creative and technical workflows, and essentially what filmmaking can teach us about life. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm so excited to dive into the third part in our multi-part video series on how I made my short film about a professional cuddler called Cuddle Buddies, which I wrote, directed, edited, and produced. This third part will really dive into the production phase of the making of the film. Each part in this series will cover a different element of production, from the script all the way to the completion of the film and beyond. And I first want to start off by emphasizing that this is purely my creative workflow and might not be a one-size-fits-all for everyone. The first part in this series covered the writing of the script, and the second part in the series covered the pre-production and planning phase of the film. So I recommend checking out both of those before we dive into this third part, since it serves a logical progression. This third part will cover the production and shooting of the film. So what is Cuddle Buddies? The logline is as follows. Cuddle Buddies tells the story of Lucy, a single mother who works as a professional cuddler in order to support her young daughter Marina and to alleviate the loneliness not only in her clients, but also in herself. Prepping for the shoot. After all the logistics for the shoot had been locked and the pre-production phase was complete, we finalized all of the remaining details a few days before our very first day of production. Part 1. Working with assistant directors. About a month prior to the start of the shoot, I had staffed up 2 assistant directors to work on the short, Justin Madriaga and Henry Brower. Much like how I'd met a lot of other crew members, I met Justin on a prior production in which we had both worked as crew members. Justin was only able to make the first 2 days of shooting as the first assistant director, so he recruited Henry to be the first assistant director for the 3rd day of the shoot. On a smaller budgeted production like ours, it is not too uncommon to have just one assistant director who functions as the first AD and to not have a second assistant director like you would on a much bigger production. The first assistant director, or first AD, is a very critical role on any production. It's one of the most thankless and stressful jobs, but one of the most crucial because they are really the person who's in charge with keeping the shoot on time and on schedule for every shoot day during the duration of the production. The first AD is also in charge with breaking down the script and creating the most efficient shooting schedule that they can. This means breaking down every detail in the script, including every scene, every cast member, every location, every prop, just to make sure that they can build the absolute most efficient schedule to keep the schedule on time and on budget. ADs are often looking at things in the script that are going to cause more complexity, meaning longer and harder days and potentially more department heads, specialty crew members to come on board for specific days, and how much more efficient those days can be, especially if they're much longer to shoot, which oftentimes means adding more time and money to the budget. Their other role is to make the day, or in other words, to keep the entire cast and crew on schedule for what's on that day's docket to be shot. This oftentimes can make them the bad guy on set, since that might mean limiting the number of takes that a director has. That might mean cracking the whip and making people move faster. That might also mean nixing certain setups that the director wanted to get that day just because they don't have time to shoot it. So really anything that the first AD can do to keep the shoot on time is their primary role. A second assistant director is often needed on much bigger shoots where there's a lot more crowd or background that needs to be managed. And oftentimes the second AD is tasked with directing the background actors, making sure they know where to walk, making sure they have certain cues that are all in conjunction with what the director and the first AD want. The second AD also really makes sure that all the background actors are checked in, they have their necessary paperwork or SAG paperwork lined up if it is a union project, and they really just make sure that all the background that's accounted for has everything that they need to make for a successful crowd shoot. The list of scenarios goes on, but a great AD can work a schedule that not only allows everything to stay on time and budget, but also allows for the best art to be captured within the time constraints and the parameters of what the location allows, and making the most successful production possible. This is an ever-changing dialogue, and that's why scheduling is very much an art form. Part 2. Building the schedule. The week before Cuddle Buddies started, Henry, Justin, Brennan, the cinematographer, and myself all jumped on a call and outlined a lot of the most important needs and answered questions for anything that Justin and Henry wanted to ask. This was all just to get a sense of what they needed to be aware of when they were doing their AD work on the actual shoot days. Some of those details included how long we could have our 6-year-old child actor on set before they needed to wrap, the more complicated scenes that involved more visual complexity, blocking, complicated lighting setups, or camera rigs, the scheduling of actors and locations, and at which day we would need what actor and for how long, art department setup time, and also setup time for every other department that was working on the film. And a note here that we asked our production designer, Jess Rock, about how long she estimated each day would take to set up and break down for all of the art department set dressings and production design needs. So all of the time estimates she gave us, we were able to factor into our conversations with Justin and Henry, so they were able to account for that when they ended up building out the call sheet and the schedule for the shoot days. We also talked with Justin and Henry about the shot list and how many setups were on the shot list, along with roughly how long it would take to set up each shot and to capture it properly. Once we had discussed those initial ideas, I was able to share the shot sheet and a stripboard with Justin and Henry, so they were able to factor everything in to put together the very first draft of a shooting schedule for the 3 days of production. After they completed the first draft of the schedule, they sent it over to Brennan and I, who looked it over, gave 1 or 2 small notes, and then we approved it. We also used the day out of days document, which is essentially a document that allows you to track which actors you have on which days, so that we could use it to calculate our running budget number. I recall that Brennan and I each had some suggestions about how to factor into the schedule some cinematography and lighting setup times, along with some directorial preferences, just to ensure that we allowed the maximum time for adequate lighting setup, but also to capture the best performances we could from the actors without rushing them. Henry and Justin made those adjustments to the shooting schedule, at which point we fully approved, and we're now ready to shoot. Part 3. The shot list and stripboard. I will also be sure to link the day out of days document along with the stripboard and the shooting schedule in the description below. A few weeks prior to shooting, Brennan and I had created a color-coded stripboard, which really allowed us to orient what scenes were going to be shot and at what point in the time frame of the story, since certain parts of the story were happening in the past and some were happening in the present, depending on what part of the story we were in. Having the color-coded stripboard also really allowed us to correspond certain colors to a certain style of lighting to really showcase a narrative purpose, but also to know what we needed to set up for and factor into, and more accurately get a sense of what would make sense to schedule based off what would be the most efficient way to schedule those scenes depending on the setup times. In some ways, this stripboard really acted as a preliminary schedule, but also as a sort of shot sheet for both of us that we were able to take to the actual shoot days and ended up becoming one of our most important documents that we could have on set. If you want to check out the stripboard we used, I'll put the link in the description below, so feel free to check it out. For the shot list process, I had spent a few weeks before the shoot really going through and creating every single shot on a spreadsheet, listing out the shot, the focal length, the name of it that we would put on the slate, and I would put a reference photo of some type from the web just to give everyone a very clear sense of what type of focal length, where the camera was supposed to be, how wide or tight the shot was. And this really acted as sort of the Bible for everybody who was on set, so we knew exactly what kind of shot we were capturing. Normally I would hire a storyboard artist for this, but since we were a little pressed for budget, I ended up just using the web to find my reference photos that I plugged into my shot sheet. As I prefer to do, I did the very first pass of the shot sheet by myself, and then I shared it with Brennan, and from there we continued to have a running dialogue where we refined it. He suggested some shots, I took some away and added some, and that's how we really built the final shot list together once that first initial pass was done. We printed and brought out multiple copies of the shot sheet to set. This really became one of the crucial documents we brought to set, which allowed us to all have a commonly shared visual language. Anytime we weren't sure what type of focal length or where the camera was supposed to be for the next setup, we could always rely back to the shot sheet and then remind ourselves where we needed to be. It really does just take out all the guesswork on the day when everyone is just very clear on what exactly the shot needs to be. This also can save some time since you don't have to further discuss or iron out what the shot is on the day. It's already mapped out and right in front of you to look at. One big note I took away from on this shoot was I definitely overshot listed the film for our schedule and time that we had. One of the best lessons I took away from was not to overshot list so that your schedule can be much more makeable, especially when you have an indie budget and you don't have as much time to capture each setup. The other thing I learned was to always be adaptable and be ready to combine or nix setups that aren't absolutely crucial as long as you have the coverage that you need for the edit. You can check out our final shot list in the description below. Part 4. Wardrobe. For the wardrobe for this film, we ended up going with clothes that all of the actors already owned. In this way, we already knew that it fit them, but it also allowed us to save a ton of budget, not having to purchase or rent any additional wardrobe and add any more cost to our budget. Since the story moved through various time periods in the past and present, it was very important to map out what type of clothing each character was wearing and at what time period in the story that was, and how it reflected what was going on in the story symbolically and metaphorically. To achieve this, we had multiple conversations with all of our actors, but especially with Caitlin, who was in every frame of the film, who had more outfits than any other character since she really was the lead of this film. To achieve this, we created a character outfits by scene document, which was essentially a spreadsheet that mapped out different photos of the outfits that the actors owned and what time period, what scene. So we would then assign the number to the scene, so whenever we knew what scene was coming up next, especially in the montage sequence where we jump around many different time periods and outfits, it was very easy to look at what scene and what outfit was corresponded to that to very quickly make sure we knew what the right outfit was. To look at the character outfit by scene document, I will also put a link to that in the description below. Part 5. Equipment rental pickups. Roughly a week before the shoot, I called U-Haul and arranged for a 15-foot box truck, which would essentially be our main production truck for all the equipment rentals and pickups that we could store in the van. On a massive production, it's much more standard for every department to have their own 15-ton grip truck, but for smaller budgeted indie productions, it's very common that you end up having just one, maybe two, and that becomes your de facto production truck for every department on the film. The day before our first day of production, which was a Thursday, I went to go pick up the U-Haul and went all over town grabbing all the different rental equipment. So I went and got the JL Fisher jib, I went to Panavision for the camera package, I went to Home Depot for some extra additional grip supplies, and essentially the way that I picked it up, I tried to make it so that it would be in the order of when it would be easiest to unload when we got to the shoot day and started our very first day of unloading. I finished up all the runs by late afternoon, and thankfully our first location allowed us to park the truck within their gate for a little bit of added security for all the expensive gear inside. Again, I will note that in the future, I probably would have hired somebody else to do these pickups, and I don't recommend you doing the pickups yourself as director, writer, and producer. This way it really frees you up to focus on the creative and directorial aspects, especially the day before the first day of your shoot. Part 6. Call sheets. The evening before our first day of the shoot, the first assistant director sent me out the first draft of the call sheet, which I looked over just to make sure all the details looked okay, and then we were able to approve it and send it out to the whole crew the night before. Usually on a call sheet, every crew member's specific call time is specified right next to their name. Since certain crew members are able to arrive at different times depending on their needs on the shoot day, the call sheet should always specify the address of the nearest hospital, along with the rough schedule of what's supposed to be shot that day, and the general crew call time, the address of the location, and any other info or parking details that the crew or cast might want to ask before they actually get there. I always find it good practice to try to email out the call sheet as early as you can the day before the shoot. That way anyone who has questions has more time to clarify. People just have a better sense of what time they need to get up, what time they need to go to sleep. Sometimes this isn't always possible since certain details are getting ironed out until the last minute, but I always find it good practice practice to send it out earlier if you can. Once we had all the details ready for the call sheet, we sent it out to the entire cast and crew the night before, and we were now ready for our first day of the shoot. If you want to check out copies of our call sheets, I'll also put those in the description below. As director, I always try my best to get a great night's sleep before the first day of any shoot, but oftentimes it's always very difficult. I usually always am more restless and anxious and kept up thinking about all the things that I need to do. I think this is very normal. I think it just shows you care. And after that first day, I find every other night of sleep after much easier. Part 7, the shoot, day 1. Our first day of the shoot consisted of shooting in a house in Van Nuys that we were able to use as multiple client bedrooms within the film. So we shot the scene with Lucy and Jeffrey, and then the other client scene with Lucy and Fiona, both in the same house. We just used different bedrooms to distinguish the different client personalities within the film. For the sake of efficiency, we really wanted to eliminate any company moves, meaning the whole crew would have to move to a different location in the middle of the shoot day. We knew we didn't have time or budget for that, so this is why we used one location for both client scenes within the film. The nice thing was each room in the house felt different enough to really feel like a different location, and also had a lot of its own built-in production design, so that meant we had to do less work to actually set up the rooms or bring our own supplies in, which again, saved us more money and time during the actual shoot. The clearest visual guide for what we shot on what days, I will put a link in the description of below, and that really is the best indicator of what we shot on what days during that 3-day production schedule. The call time for the vast majority of the crew was 7 a.m. I arrived a little before this just to make sure that we could get into the van, make sure everybody knew where to go, just to have all my ducks in a row as director so that I was as focused and ready as I could be to lead the best shoot as humanly possible. Once most of the crew showed up, each department splintered off into its respective section and started setting up its own respective department's gear. So Brennan and the camera team got to work setting up the JL Fisher camera crane, along with prepping the rest of the camera. Jess and her set dresser, Alex Torres, jumped on dressing the very first location, so we would be ready to shoot as soon as all of the other departments were ready to go. AJ Vargas, my co-producer, and the craft service person, Sean Turtle, brought coffee, some breakfast, and snacks, just so that people could really settle in with some food as they were starting to set up for our very first shot. I'll admit that I was very anxious that first hour, but once everybody started to settle into the rhythm of setup, all of my nerves really started to dissipate very quickly. We set up for roughly an hour before our first 2 actors were called to set that day. So Caitlin Clare playing Lucy and Nico Neal playing Jeffrey had a call time roughly an hour later so that they would still have time to go into hair and makeup, but also we would have plenty of time to still have everything set up before they got there, and we could minimize the amount of time that they had to wait before we could get them on set to rehearse the first scene. Once Caitlin and Nico arrived to set, we got them set up with Tiffy DeJesus so they could get their hair and makeup done, since Tiffy was our hair and makeup person. Tiffy was able to use one of the house's bathrooms as her hair and makeup station since it had a mirror and great lighting. Shortly after that, Justin, our first AD, called a mandatory safety meeting where the entire cast and crew got together, and Justin ran through the order of the day's schedule along with any rules of the house, and just really setting us all up so that we could be as safe and efficient for the most successful shoot as possible. As I find customary on all of my shoots, I then gave a short speech after just to introduce myself, my passion for the film, and really show my gratitude for everyone who was there to really help bring this vision to life, especially for how long I had been working on it to get it to that place where we were able to shoot it. I'm a firm believer that a good leader needs to set the tone with approachability, an air of collaboration, and a passion to achieve the best art possible, since it's such a team sport. After the introductions, everyone went back to work to finish setting up their respective department needs, and then I spent a lot of time with Nico and Caitlin and Jean Franzblau, our resident cuddling expert, just so we could really map out and understand the nuances of the cuddle session, and Jean could really impart some of her expertise and knowledge to both actors so that both of them could stage the scene as realistically as possible for how a real cuddle session would actually go. It was great to be able to just spend so much time with the actors actors to get comfortable with them, but also so that they felt confident not only to be in an intimate space, but they also knew what a real cuddle session should feel like. They had a real expert they could confide in, and in this way, their performance could really be protected and they could perform as freely as possible without having to worry if it was accurate or if it looked okay or if it looked proper. So when you have downtime on a shoot, I really believe that spending a lot of time discussing with the actors is such a great way to build trust, but also to get the best work out of them and allow them to really release their judgment of their performances. Gene was instrumental in helping Nico and Caitlin understand the blocking and the rhythms of a cuddle session, and it really allowed us to move faster once we actually got into shooting the client cuddle scene. Once all of our equipment and departments were set, we were finally ready to roll our first shot. The first shot was a wide moving master establishing shot using the crane. It was a little more of a complicated move to start the shoot with, and because of this, we rehearsed the move multiple times until we were finally ready to start shooting it for real. I'll never forget the feeling of when they rolled the camera for the first time and the second AC slated, and I was able to say action for the first time on this shoot. It truly was a magical feeling that I don't think I'll ever get over and nothing will be able to replace. That adrenaline and excitement mixed with a little bit of fear is such an absolute rush and thrill, and there's nothing like it on the planet if you get to do it. It took us about 8 takes to finally get the first shot completed, and at that point we finally were starting to build our momentum. We were able to move through the living room and eventually get that coverage completed until we could move into the bedroom to capture the rest of the cuddle session scene between Caitlin and Jeffrey. It is also worth noting that in between takes, Jessica and Alex were set dressing the second bedroom so that as soon as we were done with the first one, the second location was already ready to be shot. And then while we shot the second scene, Jess and Alex were also able to wrap the first bedroom so that by the time we finished our second location, the whole house was pretty much cleaned up and we were ready to load out. This is such a great way to get ahead and save time and kill 2 birds with 1 stone. We moved through covering multiple angles for each actor during the client cuddle scene, and admittedly it was a very long dialogue scene, but Caitlin and Nico were absolutely prepared and did such a stellar job, and every time I watch that scene, I'm still so impressed with how they were able to manage that many lines of dialogue while also still having to work through all the mechanics of what a real cuddling session would feel like. Very often, a lot of what the actors did early on informed the essential structure of the scene, and oftentimes the only notes I would be giving were just small little physical changes or body movement changes solely for framing purposes, and sometimes it was just trying different ways of saying a take just so we had options in the edit. But because the actors were doing such a great job, and because we had had a lot of conversations before the shoot days, a lot of what I was giving notes on were very minuscule and technical things. Key takeaway number 1. One of the biggest lessons I learned shooting this film was that oftentimes when you're really running behind schedule, the best way to save time is to run only a subsection of a scene and not run the entire thing from start to finish. If you're really behind, only take a chunk of that scene and make sure you run it just from a very specific section to another specific section. This way you really save time not having to run the entire thing over and over, because oftentimes you'll have it covered from another angle. As long as you make sure you have enough coverage to save yourself in the edit, this is a surefire way to really make sure that you save yourself time when you're actually on the shoot days. This can also make it a little easier for your actors who don't have to remember the entire scene, but just a smaller section of it. Key takeaway number 2. I've often found that when you really want to keep the momentum going, and again, if you're short on time, sometimes the best thing you can do is keep the camera rolling after a scene, especially if you cut it midway through. Resume the scene as soon as you can, keep people moving, get everyone back to the set position, and run it again before you call cut. In this way, it allows you a little bit of extra leeway. Sometimes the ADs really don't appreciate, but sometimes it's what you need as a director just to ensure you get that one extra take before someone else can call cut, because oftentimes it's the director who really should be the one saying cut in most situations. So this is a small little technique that buys you a little extra time and maybe one additional take that really can end up saving you in the edit. I also find it helpful to cut the take in the middle. If one little thing goes wrong, you don't want to waste the whole rest of the take just wishing you would have called cut. Sometimes the easiest thing you can do is just say cut, reset immediately, and run it again. Don't waste everyone's time if the take isn't usable. As is fairly typical on day 1, we were running running a decent amount of the way behind schedule, but once we were able to get our rhythm, I think we were off to the races. Finally, we finished our first full scene of the film, and now we were able to break for lunch. We had to push our lunch start a little bit later, but we still granted that full hour. Oftentimes, you find yourself working through lunch as a director, really looking ahead to what the next scene is that you're gonna shoot. For me, I do a little prep work, talk with my crew, talk with the DP, do a little bit of prep work with the actors, and then I really try to get some food and at least enjoy half that lunch so I have the necessary energy to continue to finish the day. After lunch, we were able to wrap Nico playing Jeffrey and stagger the call time of Christina Pesic, who is playing Fiona. We called Christina in to arrive right after lunch ended, and then we were able to send Caitlin and Christina into the second bedroom to shoot the second client scene where Lucy cuddles with Fiona's character. Our art department had the second bedroom predominantly set up, and Brennan and I came in and just did a little bit of tweaking to the lighting plan, and then we were pretty much ready to shoot. I remember we ended up going with a little bit more of a darker lighting plan than was originally planned, but that was one of those great happenings where on the day we realized this just felt more organic to the scene and added a nice contrast to the more brightly lit setup from the first bedroom scene. We ran an initial rehearsal with Jean, Caitlin, and Christina, and I have to say that initial rehearsal had such a vibrant and incredible energy. The one thing I wish we would have done is shot that rehearsal, because at least we would have had it on camera. Personally, I think it never hurts to shoot the rehearsal, especially if you have the lighting set up the way you want it. I just feel like shoot it, and at least you have it on camera. At worst, you shot it. At best, you have an incredibly fresh moment that is hard to replicate, especially on a second time running the scene. Much like a first impression with a person, sometimes that very first impression is the most memorable. Out of respect for the actors, since the scene dealt with some very emotionally heavy topics, we kept the crew inside the bedroom to an absolute minimum. That way the actors could feel the most free to go to those places and have the least amount of people right there watching them and taking them out of the emotional headspace of the scene. The second scene went beautifully, and we were able to wrap before our scheduled shoot time was supposed to end. We were able to avoid any overage charges from the location if we did go into overtime. We broke down all of our gear and loaded out as quickly as possible, and the first day was in the can. Wrapping the first day signaled a major victory in my mind, mainly because it gave me the faith and confidence that I did know what I was doing as a director, and I had a very clear vision of what the film needed to be. But also, I think I was able to show the crew I knew what I was doing. We also had the momentum on our side now of one day already completed and only 2 more to go, and we all knew we could function as a collective unit at this point, and all we had to do was do it 2 more days in a row. That concludes part 1 of production, which is the 3rd section of our multi-part video case study series on the making of my short film Cuddle Buddies. Leave a comment below, leave a thumbs up. Let me know if there's any other ways that you do production or any other production topics you want me to cover, and I'll definitely make sure to cover them in a future video. Stay tuned for next week, since we will cover the second part of production, and I will definitely see you there.